Hi everyone, my name is Nisreen Kamal. I am the Arabic editor of the China Global South project. And let me tell you a little bit about the work we're doing before you get to today's podcast. So basically, if you check the news to look for stories about China's ties with the United States or Europe, you will definitely find a lot. But when it comes to stories about China's relations with developing countries, which we call the Global South, it's a different situation. So this is where we come in because we provide you with in-depth analysis and daily reporting about China's activities in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and even the Americas. And our services are available in 3 languages, which are English, Arabic, and French. So you can subscribe to our services for only $15 a month. You can try it for free for 30 days at chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. Once again, that's chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. Thank you.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in lovely Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
And also joining us today, our good friend and Francophone editor, Neema. A very good afternoon to you as well.
Bonjour, good afternoon to you guys.
Guys, we have a lot to get through today. It's been an incredibly busy week, as always. Again, we thought that this time of year things might slow down a bit. That is definitely not the case. Cobus, let's get started with our regular series, Where in the World is Xi Jinping Going? This has been something that we have been talking about now for, 3 or 4 weeks? All the speculation as to where Xi Jinping will go to finally reemerge onto the international stage. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, the rumors started circulating that he was going to go to Saudi Arabia. That never happened. Then the rumors started coming out, and even it was confirmed by Indonesia that he was going to go to the G20 summit in Bali later in November, and then possibly up to Thailand for the APEC summit. Again, no confirmations, no word on any of this coming from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. This week, though, we got confirmation from the Kazakh government and the Uzbeki government that he's going to go to Central Asia to take part in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. That's going to supposedly to happen next week. The only reason I say supposedly, of course, the summit is going to happen. Whether Xi Jinping is going to go is a totally different story. Now, there's a wrinkle on this because in the meeting in Uzbekistan, where lots of leaders are going to be, one other leader is going to be there, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and there is word now from the Russian side that Xi and Putin are going to meet on the sidelines of the SCO summit. So, Cobus, very quickly here, what do you make of all of this speculation about Xi Jinping, where he's going to go, and when he's finally going to emerge onto the international stage?
Well, it's interesting that this confirmation, quote unquote, kind of came from the Russian ambassador to China, and we'll see. There's been no confirmation yet from the foreign ministry in China on this issue. So what China watchers have been taking the idea that he might travel before this momentous party conference where he's supposed to be entering a third term, they're taking it as a sign of confidence that he doesn't expect any kind of challenges from within the party to his taking a third term, which is unprecedented in the post-Mao era. So so there's that. It'll be very interesting to see whether he actually goes and whether the Putin meeting happens. If it does, then then I think that will probably be met with some alarm and dismay, in the West, which will probably have its own momentum.
Okay, so we will find out next week if this rumor and these confirmations from the Russian side are in fact correct. It feels a little bit like Charlie Brown with Lucy and the Football, where you think it's going to happen and then it doesn't happen. So Let's find out. The event is supposed to take place on September 14th and 15th in Uzbekistan. Again, leading up to that is a trip potentially to Kazakhstan. So let's keep an eye on that. In fact, I also heard rumors this week from other people that he was planning a trip to Africa. So who knows what's going to happen, but we'll find out next week if he's going to go to Kazakhstan. Let's turn our attention now to Africa. And by far, the big story of the week came out of Ghana. The woman known as the Galamsey Queen, Aisha Huang, she reappeared in the news. This was a woman who back in 2018 was deported from Ghana in a very high-profile fashion. She was a well-known illegal miner who had a very big operation. In many ways, she was the kind of the case study, just the shining example of everything that is wrong about the China-Africa relationship back in 2018, the complicity of the Ghanaian government, the illegal mining, all of this stuff. When she was deported, it was huge news, and everybody thought, well, that's it. She's gone. Well, it turns out that she's back, and she appeared back in Ghana. She snuck back in to the country back in May, and just this week, it was revealed by the government that she's now going to appear before a court. Now, this is very interesting because it sparked a huge reaction inside Ghana. It was national news. There were 9 o'clock specials on national television. Let's play some of the reaction here to set up what has been going on. First, I'm going to play some sound from legal scholar Ace Nkoma, who laid out the frustrations that a lot of people are feeling about the whole Aisha Huang case.
Instead of trying Aisha Huang, we spirited her out of the country. She's back. Because there's something here. It's gold. We don't know our gold. If she's prepared to risk a return to this country, risk jail for our gold, apparently she's here from the beginning of the year. Yeah. Right? This is interesting. There's something here. But this is the point. They allowed her to go. We told the president about this. I hear government people were not happy with our attitude. Sydney doesn't care. I don't care. We said what we had to do. Today, she's back. Because we didn't jail her. We didn't give the court the opportunity to even free her. So if she's back, she's running to our arms. Are we going to free her again? Are we going to make another mistake because the president admitted it's a mistake?
File another null prosecution.
But listen to this. If you didn't jail Aisha Huang, who can you jail? That's why we say the day we let her go was the day we lost the fight against Galamsey.
This can be an opportunity to...
She has come back into our waiting arms. So what do you do when Bedafwa Adam comes back? Let's take her through the judicial process. If she wins, she wins. If she loses, she loses. But you cannot jail a Ghanaian when you allow the Chinese to run away.
So Nkoma was speaking on City Television, which is one of the major national networks. Again, they were running primetime specials dedicated to this issue, just to give you a sense of how big a story this was. And again, the frustration was rather than jailing her in Ghana, she was deported. And up until last year, or maybe the year before, this was what happened in many African countries when Chinese nationals were convicted. Rather than do their sentences in Africa, they were then deported. So this changed, though, in Malawi, where poachers, there was a two husband and wife team who received very long sentences, 12, 14-year sentences. And then more recently in Rwanda, where a Chinese miner who savagely beat one of his employees was sentenced, I think, was to 20 years, and he's now forced to serve that sentence in Rwanda. So this is the frustration that they're speaking about. Now, let me now play another reaction, also on City FM's Eyewitness News program. So City was really covering this quite a bit from every different angle. This is government spokesman Palgrave Bouquet-Dankwa, who explained the administration's position, again, defending the administration's handling of this. And let's take a listen to what he had to say.
When you say she arrived with forged documents, did she also go through official borders? Did she go through illegal routes or official borders to enter the country?
She entered through official borders with forged documents.
And we allowed her to go past the immigration checkpoints?
She entered through the immigration checkpoint with her face and a different name.
But we have a biometric system that we deploy. I believe it's connected to people's passports. Does our system not have any way of flagging someone who is entering with a wrong passport or forged documents when their biometric is already captured in the system, considering that this is no mean a person but a deportee from the Republic of Ghana?
Well, truly, very well. But we are aware that when she entered into the country, security services followed to be sure that she was the right person. And you are aware how a lot of Asians look alike. And it took us a bit of time to be able to be sure that she was the same person that was deported in 2017. And we must commend the security services, especially the national security and the rest of the security services that really aided in bringing her arrest to the country.
Geraud, he did not say that all Asians look alike, did he? I mean, it's just ridiculous for him to say that.
I was just trying to keep myself not to burst in laugh. But
that is his case. You can hear the different points that are being made here. Again, there's frustrations on the governance side that she wasn't convicted and had to serve her time in Ghana, that she was allowed to be deported, and then frustrations that the biometric ID system did not work, that she crossed a land border. The security services didn't pick her up. Of course, there's a lot of concerns about terrorism, and that's the justification for some of these border controls that they've put up. And if she got through, then, how did this happen? And then that she was able to resume illegal mining again. And this is something that has been very frustrating. So, Geraud, let's get your take on all of this, especially because there are some lot of parallels here between what's happening in Ghana with illegal mining in Cameroon and also in the DRC.
Exactly. So the problem here speaks a lot to a lot of issues. First of all, the border control issues in Ghana. I think they should look at it more seriously because this should not be happening, but it's happening. And it's really frustrating when you see situations like this happening in Ghana, but in the same time, we cannot take it, as you were saying, cannot take it in a more isolated way. It's a part of a much bigger part and a much bigger trend that we see in Africa, where when it comes to gold exploitation in Ghana, in Mali, Senegal, DRC, you have the same situation, the same pattern on terms of event. You see the same actors, you see small-scale miners doing illegal operation. Either it's illegal, either they're protected by powerful people. And second of all, you have pollution and environmental issues happening in all those places, all those complaints coming from local communities. And third, you have protection, political protection, either coming from local politicians or national politicians. And we have the same story, the same pattern, the same behavior. And at the end, even national government, they also find themselves in a position where they cannot really act. They did that in Cameroon, they did that in Mali, in DRC. Those people, they always find a way to come back in the country to resume their operation, and they always find a way to be protected with powerful people, either people in the army or politicians. So you kind of ask yourself if there is a real political will from politicians in Africa, in those countries, to really act on this situation. And my take will be that they don't really have the incentive to do so, because for many of those countries, it's not a big issue. And secondly, for politicians, when you do gold exploitation and everything with the Chinese, it's quick cash. The money is too high, it's too fast, it's too easy for them to just, act on those Galamsey in Ghana and other operation in Mali or in Senegal or elsewhere in Africa. So yeah, that speaks about a much bigger issues on the continent related to Chinese and gold exploitation in Africa.
Cobus, what's your take?
I think it's more historically freighted in African history than gold. It was the basis of all of this really horrifying kind of exploitation by, in the colonial era. And so, so kind of the continent's gold being stolen by foreigners is such a fundamental part of African history, that it's surprising for me that African politicians aren't more sensitive to it and, kind of using it more to, for public relations ends. Like the Ghanaian government looks really flat-footed, I think, in this case, and possibly deeply corrupt. Because, for example, it was shown that a bunch of businesses that she was running kept running right through the time when she was supposedly deported, and the Ghanaian government didn't even know that they were running, for example. And who legitimately doesn't know something and who pretends not to know something is always a very, very kind of kind of blurry border there. So, I have a lot of sympathy for the kind of outrage in Ghana around this issue. And it is interesting that the Ghanaian press is really going to town on the story.
Again, to your point that it really makes the Ghanaian government look bad, especially because the administration last year launched 2 very high-profile campaigns to crack down on the Galamsey, on illegal mining in the countryside, and it didn't really have that much effect. And they basically didn't get what they wanted because many of the Chinese miners and many of the other Galamsey, and again, very important to point out here that the Galamsey is not uniquely a Chinese issue. There are illegal miners from Nigeria, the illegal mining also taking place among Ghanaians. It is a very, very vast and complex issue. The Chinese are one among many actors here, but very few people were arrested because they were tipped off. And this goes to the governance question, Cobus, that we see over and over again, as Geraud pointed out, in a number of different countries. So, Geraud, when we look at the issue of this question of illegal mining, whether it's illegal rosewood timber harvesting in Cameroon and Nigeria, whether it's the illegal mining in the eastern Congo, whether it's illegal forestry in the Republic of Congo or the Galamsey in Ghana, again, as you pointed out, we see this all over the place. There's a lot of frustration on civil society. You heard that from the lawyer on city television. What can be done? What are the options here? And what kind of pressure can be put on the Chinese to do anything, if they can do anything at all? Maybe this isn't a Chinese issue. This is, at the end of the day, this is up to the Ghanaian government to enforce their border controls and their mining laws. Do the Chinese have any role in this?
Exactly. The question is, can they really go away from these business opportunities? Because when you speak to Chinese officials on the continent, ambassadors or diplomats, to try to understand why they don't put much pressure on their people in those operations, they always tell you that, those Chinese who are here, they are here because they are in partnership with many powerful people in your countries, either a minister, either a general. I cannot just come and say you should go because he's here legally, quote unquote legally, because the one who made him come here protected him and he's receiving protection from those people. So at the end, the Chinese, in terms of ambassadors, they're going to be telling you, yeah, there's so much we can do. At the end, it's your problem. It's a very an African problem to say, how can we stop it? And the problem is, as I was mentioning earlier, there's too much money, easy, quick money, where you don't need to involve huge investment. You don't have to put a lot of money inside. So you have in the scale of the situation, you have so much and so many people who have incentive to keep it going. So from maybe national government to provincial to local government, you always have people who are going to, to help those people to make money and by also helping themselves to make money. So the incentive really to act on it, it's not really there. The people who are going to complain are only the civil society, local communities who are not benefiting from it. But from the powerful people, from the governance issues, that you're going to find few people with the real incentive to act on those issues.
What's your prediction? Do you think she's going to get a jail sentence and a conviction that she'll have to serve in Ghana, or does she get deported again?
My bet will be we can go for a public relation operation. They can deport her again and try to launch another anti-Galamsey operation just to calm down the population. But they can also be inspired with what's happening in Rwanda, in other countries. They can do that, but I don't know if they're really gonna go in that direction though. It's really, and next election is next year, I believe. So they might really, they might go on to put in prison just to use it and maybe an electoral argument again.
That's my take. I think she's made some very powerful people look very, very silly. She's pissed them off big time. And my guess is that she's going to spend the next 20 years of her life in a Ghanaian prison.
I hope so.
Because politics demand it now. Politics demands that the government do something about this. And when you have 9 o'clock specials on city television dedicated to this issue, my guess is the president is going to somehow find a way to make sure she gets the book thrown at her. That's my take on it. Let's move on very quickly. We're going to stay in the DRC. We're going to stay with mining. This is an interesting story that came out on Monday from the Paris-based news service Africa Intelligence. They published a story by journalist Olivier Liffrand entitled U.S. Disillusioned over failure to turn DR Congo away from Beijing. Now, this caught our attention, obviously, because Geraud follows this very, very closely. Let me read you a little bit from the story, and then I'm going to get Geraud's take on it. And he followed up with his own story on this that got quite a bit of traction and a lot of attention on Twitter. So here's what they said, what Olivier said in his story. Ever since Felix Tshisekedi took power, Washington had hoped he would curb China's huge influence in the country. 4 years later, the United States is bitterly disappointed that it has failed to break Beijing's hegemony in strategic mining issues. So again, this very interesting topic. They are disillusioned, Geraud. You then turned around on Tuesday and you responded again with a very compelling column entitled, Why the U.S. Shouldn't Be Surprised About China's Close Ties with DRC Mining Companies. Okay, give us your take on both the Olivier story, which unfortunately we really couldn't see very much because it was behind the very rigid paywall that Africa Intelligence has. But we got the gist of it, and we've been following the story, and we've been hearing from insiders about this very issue for years. So it wasn't a huge surprise to us. But give us your take on why the U.S. really shouldn't be surprised, and what's surprising here is that the U.S. is disillusioned.
Yes, that's really surprising that the U.S. is disillusioned by what's happened in the Congo. So in my column this week, I spoke about the issue, and I gave two main reasons why that situation should not be surprising people either in Washington or elsewhere in the world. First of all, I spoke about the fact that, there's no alternative to Chinese. When the US are pressuring, you have to leave, you have to part ways with Chinese because corruption, because of this, and because different situation in the country, because of bad governance. They don't offer an alternative situation, or an alternative solution, an alternative viable solution. When I speak about viable solution, I take into account the fact that we are talking about one of the most corrupted country and the most unstable country in Africa and even in the world. Rich country, a lot of natural resources, but a very poor mining governance and political governance in general, putting the country where you have a lot of corruption and bad institutions. In that set of environment where the way situation are right there, you don't have a lot of Westerners or American companies who are willing to come and do business there. And the US government has less close to non-incentive or even power to force any American company to come in that environment. So taking that into context, when you put that in that context, they don't really have an opportunity. They don't really have an alternative to offer to Tshisekedi or to the Congolese government to say, okay, get rid of the Chinese, and we're gonna send you a new company to come to do business there. First, this is the first reason. And the second reason, which is really connected to the first reason, is the bad governance environment where mining companies and mining sectors has been used many years by politicians to fund different political activities. And the Congo hold-up inquiry investigation has showed us how some Chinese company were involved in those kind of operations. So because of that flexibility, I call it flexibility of Chinese company to be able to, to do business in this kind of environment, to compromise with political leaders, it gives them this advantage and put them in a position where Congolese government and Congolese politicians feels more comfortable doing business with those companies than doing with Western companies. And Glencore, a Switzerland company who's doing operation in DRC, has been sued in London and in Washington for corruption practices in the DRC and has been condemned for that. So when you have that, you see that as a Western company, you really don't want to go to the DRC. And from the DRC perspective, as long as the mining industry and the governance remain a very corrupted and unstable environment, the Chinese will always remain those people. You can go to more easily and talk about business, and they can adapt to the situation. And finally, what was really surprising to me is that when you take all that into account, you have all those elements on the table. Those elements are public knowledge, and those elements, you can find them when you really take a look into the Congolese political arena and governance situation. You find that's really surprising that in Washington, there were people who really, really believed that Congo is going to get rid of the government is going to get rid of the Chinese. And that was really surprising to me. It speaks a lot about the ability of Washington to understand the political dynamic in DRC or even in elsewhere in Africa. And it bears the question to really wonder, does Washington has the ability to really design and drive a very coherent Africa policy, especially when it aims to counterbalancing China influence on the continent. That was my take on the column on that story this week.
Geraud, is your feeling that the long game for American stakeholders in all of this is literally to just try and kind of evolve beyond cobalt? To just find some other way of like powering, electric vehicles and so on that doesn't kind of draw on these supply chains. And in the meanwhile, while they're trying to do that, just kind of be satisfied with buying refined cobalt directly from China. Is that roughly the play, do you think?
Yes, I do believe that, first of all, there is an important thing, an important distinction to do here. Because when you talk about the US, even the article that talk about Washington, we've seen that in the past, how American companies, we say that American companies behave differently from the rhetoric from Washington when they talk about the Chinese. And you have that feeling that many American companies then don't really mind having China in the DRC, because when you have China in the DRC, Chinese are taking all the hits, all the risk. But at the end, down the supply chain, they can do business. They still do business with different companies in the world, Westerns, Americans, whoever who's doing business with them. So that's put aside. What you mentioned is very important, because moving beyond cobalt, we believe that Americans, based on that, will be the one driving the trend. But it's the Chinese, those who are controlling the cobalt supply chain, are saying we need to move beyond cobalt. We need to find other sustainable or more easy to find resources. That's why they're going to lithium. So yes, there is a strong will in the industry to move beyond cobalt, and that it's not really driven by the Americans per se. It's more driven by the Chinese, but we see a lot of trend happening there.
Cobus, I will kind of pull the focus out a little bit in saying that this really doesn't have that much to do about cobalt, and as much about the fact that this is the prime example of what happens when the United States has not invested in these relationships, not just in Africa, but in Southeast Asia and South America as well, opening up the space for the Chinese to fill that vacuum. And I would say the same thing is happening right now in front of our eyes in the lithium triangle in South America, where Chinese companies are making very big moves. Again, a lot of these countries in the global South are pleading for the Americans to get involved, and Europeans as well. Not because they don't want the Chinese necessarily, but because they want engagement. They want to see the Americans present. And in many ways, for me, what's happened here in the DRC is really the best example of what happens when you neglect this kind of engagement. The Americans have not brought money to the table. They have not brought companies to the table. They have not brought solutions. And this is what happens. There is no alternative to the Chinese in the DRC. And in many other places, like here in Southeast Asia, the scope and scale of Chinese engagement here in Southeast Asia is so large, by orders of magnitude larger than what the Americans are doing. At the end of the day, then a country X, whatever country it says, listen, I have no other choice. I have to go with the Chinese. And to me, what's happened here in the Congo should be a warning sign to people in Washington. But fundamentally, the problem is that in Washington, you can't get people to pay attention to these countries. There's just no oxygen left in the room because of the politics being what they are in Washington today.
I mean, I completely take that point, but I also wonder, kind of where one draws the line between engagement, and relationship building, particularly kind of diplomatically, and then all of the pressure that United States companies face under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. How does one build relationships in the DR Congo if one is also facing a lot of kind of attention around the issue of foreign corruption, and the larger kind of reality is that this kind of enhanced laws on American companies, I think, have really improved the way that they do business in the global South. It puts a lot of scrutiny on them. And it avoids a lot of these kind of horrifying issues that we've seen through, kind of decades of Western companies kind of getting in very shady deals with global South governments. So I was wondering, kind of whether there's a situation there where, not to sound like some kind of a realist IR person, but where kind of the either the US is kind of too ethical for its own economic good, or whether kind of whether there's some kind of relationship building or influence building, kind of that we're missing? Kind of, is there a way of maintaining these relationships in a place that's so starkly corrupt like the DRC without paying someone?
That's the question I wanted to raise myself. I was like, yes, I saw one of the comments we received when we post the story. People were asking, so maybe the American can, not only the Americans, because also in Europe you have the same situation. Maybe they should go more easy on their companies when they go to those, corrupted countries like the DRC or different countries in the global south, to give them a certain leeway, to allow them certain practices so they can do business. Because if they don't do that, the reality is those countries are not, first of all, they don't have the incentive to change. The political leaders in those countries, they have less incentive to put a very good governance situation in those countries. So you don't have partners you can talk to so they can, change the situation. And when they don't do that, you don't go, and when you don't go, you let the Chinese go and take the market. And that's why I said at the end, what the politicians are saying in Washington, in Paris, in Brussels, are not the concern that, business leaders are sharing in Wall Street. Because we haven't seen that much complaint from the business in Wall Street saying that we are really worried, we are losing market shares because of the Chinese control. No, they're still thriving. So at the end, those business leaders are saying, yes, we are more realistic. We let the Chinese take the raw material. We're going to find a way to do business with them down the supply chain.
I think the counter argument to what I raised before is that foreign companies already have such free reign in Africa. It's crazy. Like we saw that a significant part of the current economic crisis in Zambia is partly due to an early IMF deal that essentially exempted foreign companies mining copper in Zambia from paying taxes. C.K. Lee has shown in her research that essentially the Zambian tax base, because of this IMF reform, the Zambian tax base was essentially hollowed out, and the entire Zambian middle class essentially went with it. So and that's completely legal. That's not even due to corruption. That's just like lawmaking and deal making with the IMF. So the idea that foreign companies should somehow have even more leeway to do whatever they want in Africa is insane. But then at the same time, like, all of these factors that you raise are all in play.
It's not going to happen that the United States is going to relax the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for certain countries. That's just not the way that laws work. Also, that is a concession on our values that I think doesn't play well in Washington. So that was an argument that came up online that said, well, maybe exceptions can be made for the Congo. And that's just not the way it works. And laws then have to be changed by either Congress or the Supreme Court. It's not up to the executive branch to be selective on that front and to be able to change the laws on that. So that's very complicated. My frustration here in all of this argument is the fact that the United States simply cannot compete in this sector in the DRC for cobalt. But yet the rhetoric coming out of the new Inflation Reduction Act legislation and the talk coming out of the likes of Peter Pham, who is the China hawk in Washington, is that, the United States can, in fact, be an alternative to China. It can't. So I guess the question, Cobus, to your point, for me, is just the United States and Europe have to pick the areas where they're competitive. Tech, services, finance, capital formation, lots of areas, education. And at the end of the day, acknowledge the areas that they're not, and then really deep dive engagement in those areas. The problem is, and we hear this over and over and over again from most global South countries, is we don't hear from the Americans. And there's word coming out that U.S. embassies are understaffed in Africa, that something like 20% of all embassies do not have ambassadors. And by the way, this isn't just an African thing. Italy doesn't have an ambassador from the United States. Italy, a G7 country, doesn't have an ambassador. So you got to wonder, what the hell is going on? It's a broken, dysfunctional political system in Washington that blocks the ambassadorships from being confirmed. And what we end up having, again, is this lack of engagement. And I just want to point out to every American policymaker who's listening to this show, what's happening in the DRC, to me, is the end result of that, is you're going to get boxed out over and over and over again. And by the way, this is the same when it comes to music, right? So Boomplay is kicking Apple's butt and Spotify's butt in Africa. Okay, it's the same thing in transit. We got the Cobus? We got, I think, the first half numbers. Oh, no, the second quarter numbers on smartphones in Africa this week.
Yeah.
Something like 52% is transit. Huge.
Yeah.
Yes, true.
Huge.
48%, I think, of smartphones. Yeah.
And in vertical after vertical after vertical.
Yeah.
If these companies aren't going to engage, and if the government isn't going to support them, and if the society isn't going to engage, you're leaving the buffet wide open for the Chinese. Giraud, let's give you the last word.
Yes, I'd like to come back to what you mentioned of the issues to come back, because I see also Cobus would like to add something. The issue about the diplomatic issue, and I talked about it in my column. At the end, in the case of DRC and even many African countries, you can feel that the question always remains from the African counterparts to ask who's driving the Africa policy in Washington. Because when you mentioned Peter Pham, when you have so many actors coming in, former diplomats turned lobbyists and everything, coming into speaking to political leaders, at the end, you just kind of wonder, when he speaks, does he speak with Washington support behind him? When he's making promises, does he do that with all full Washington power behind him?
No,
or he's just speaking on behalf of some sort of.
Let me just be very clear. Peter Pham does not have the backing of the White House right now.
So that's the kind of problem at the end when you're an African leader. You're like, okay, when an ambassador is speaking to me, I really don't know if he's speaking to me with all the power of the Washington. But when I'm speaking with a Chinese ambassador in Africa, you are pretty much sure that what he's telling you is coming straight from Beijing. And you know that, it's almost a quite done deal when he says something, which is not the case with American diplomats.
Okay, let's move on to our last topic. A very interesting week, and this talking about the Americans and engagement. This made me think of this today when we were putting the show together about why this China-Africa space talk that took place this week was so important. So astronauts Chen Dong, Liu Yang, and Cai Shuzhe spoke with young people in 8 African countries. They spoke from the Chinese space station high above the Earth. 8 African countries included Algeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Namibia, Nigeria, Senegal, Somalia, and South Africa. This was a choreographed event where basically for an hour and a half in all of these different locales, embassies organized a live video feed in conjunction with the African Union in Ethiopia, and kids got to submit their questions to the astronauts, and it was held in French, Arabic, and English. Let's take a listen to hear how Chinese state television positioned the whole event. And so we're going to have 2 clips just to give you a little bit of flavor of what's happened. I looked for other coverage of it, and there wasn't any, so we're kind of relegated to what CGTN did. But again, it's very important to hear what CGTN had to say on this because it speaks to the propaganda and also the public diplomacy aspect of this.
Young people from all across the African continent asked the Shenzhou 14 taikonauts a wide range of questions Tuesday. Everything from whether they could see the Great Wall from the space station to how challenging their careers have been.
Since the Great Wall of China can be seen from space, is it also possible to see the Sahara Desert and Mount Kilimanjaro from the Tiangong space station?
在太空是看不到长城的。
So the astronaut said, apparently you cannot see the Great Wall of China from space. That's a myth that we all grew up with for a very long time, but he did acknowledge that you can see Mount Kilimanjaro and the Sahara Desert as well. So that was super interesting in terms of that ability for these kids to be able to interact. But again, to this idea of the public diplomacy part of it. And again, for me, on a public diplomacy communication side, this was just a huge win. And let's get a take now from CGTN's correspondent in Cairo as to why. And I think you'll see where I'm coming from on this.
Hearing taikonauts and Chinese space officials say that if they work hard, one day they may get on board the Chinese Space Agency, the event opened students' eyes to opportunities many thought were impossible. Talking to the Shenzhou 14 taikonauts was inspirational. It made a young generation start thinking about how they can take Egypt to space.
So first of all, they've been using this word taikonauts, and for people not familiar with the Chinese space world, that's a weird word. That's the Chinese way of saying astronaut, because in Chinese, Tiankong is space. So they've kind of made this word called taikonaut out of Tiankong. So that's just to clarify that. But Cobus, this to me is one of those really just, again, I think they hit a win on this one, because it speaks to African youth. It's about empowerment. It's about optimism. And it really is very different than the narratives that we hear traditionally coming out of the West and the outside world towards Africa as, again, the basket case, dependency, war, famine, disease, all the negatives here. And it made me think about, Jack Ma's Business Heroes competition that he ran before he was sidelined, again, about entrepreneurialism and tech. And these are the kinds of things that the US and Europe, actually, in many ways, are much stronger than the Chinese. The US has a much larger space program, and so do the Europeans, but yet the Chinese took the initiative to do this type of event with the African Union, focused on young people. And all in all, I thought it was a huge win.
Yeah, I mean, kind of you're right. The Americans and the Europeans do have bigger space programs. Like we were joking beforehand that that they're so hell bent on keeping Africans out of the US and Europe that they probably want to keep them out of space as well.
Very cynical of you, Cobus. Very, very cynical.
I think I agree. I think the Jack Ma kind of analogy is really accurate, because both of them really play into these kind of very strong African narratives of a new generation that can kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps via technology. So it's like a very kind of like techno-optimist kind of story that is simultaneously the kind of thing that parents with ambitions for their children love to imagine their children kind of like moving into, So it plays with parents, it plays with kids. It's very media friendly in Africa, and it is interesting that no one else has thought of actually trying to harness that energy for public diplomacy purposes.
It's really interesting. It speaks a lot, and Cobus, I think, has covered many part of it. But it's really interesting, that technology part of the story, because you see that for me, it's kind of communicating that story of saying that us as Chinese, we can speak to African despite all of your issues, economic issues, development issues. We can speak to you about things of the future. You can dream of the future. We can help you get into the future with technology, with this astronaut kind of thing, because we don't want to keep you in a place of humanitarian causes. We don't want to keep you in a place where you only speak about poverty, corruption. We talk about agriculture issue. We can also talk to you about technology, that you can dream, that your youth can dream of big, going to space and everything. So yeah, the Chinese are kind of like, they're presenting themselves as, we are your friends who can help you move up. We can help you leap to development, to forgetting all your issues. We can help you really grow fast. But in the US or even Europe, as you say, they have a very strong astronauts program. But you have that, this kind of conversation did not happen, because maybe they felt that, we don't have an audience in Africa. We don't have people who are following it. We don't have the youth who are interested by that. They're the more like social issues. We're going to focus on more aid, development, and election, and all those kind of issues. And the Chinese, yes, in terms of public diplomacy, they're winning this game with the astronaut story.
Yeah, like I completely agree. That thing of like, we're your friends that will help you, like in a way one could put that as, we're your friends from the future, like in a sense, like it's like, we see your future, you have a future, like, and we proved it because we're living that future now as a developing country, so let's go. Kind of like that kind of narrative, yeah.
Cobus, do you remember last year when we did a show focused on the youth summit that French President Emmanuel Macron had in Montpellier, and there were this group of young civil society activists on the stage in Montpellier who said, we are tired of your paternalism. We are tired of the aid. We're tired of the charity. And they were just berating him of this. We want you to treat us as equals. We want you to treat us as, as partners, but not as dependents. And this is the part of the Chinese narrative that they get right. Again, so much of what the Chinese do in many parts of the global South is messed up, is wrong, is open to a lot of criticism. But when they do things right, like this week with this taikonaut astronaut thing, they deserve the credit. One other key point here that's very interesting was there was a very strong emphasis on women and girls in science in this whole event. I don't know if you guys noticed this when you watched the clips of it, but there were a lot of girls. They put a lot of girls up to ask questions. And there is a female astronaut up on the space station who talked about the role of women and science and what it's like for being a woman up in the space station and how there was no accommodation made for her. She had to work just as hard as everybody else. And to me, that too was a very, very compelling and powerful message that the Chinese also deserve credit for, because girls in Africa, just like in many other parts of the world, get tracked off very early away from science and especially things like space. So kudos. That was a big win to me this week and something very positive that I think everybody should take a look at. I wish there was more international media coverage. Nobody covered this. And that to me is unfortunate too. I mean, local media did. They got a lot of local media, but international media, there was no international media coverage of this. And I think that speaks to our earlier point about the DRC, the fact that the outside world isn't paying attention to these kinds of things. Let's be honest. Nobody watches CGTN. Nobody cares about Chinese propaganda, okay? But Geraud, when these things are happening and nobody knows about it outside of Africa and local media, this is, to me, why they're going to get left behind.
Exactly. This is why really they're just going to lose track of what's happening on the ground, lose track on what people are actually telling them, what the youth in Africa, what the political leaders are telling them in Africa, because they kind of they seem to have a narrative. They say, this is the narrative we want you to fit in. So when we speak to you, we're going to talk to you based on that narrative. And they just don't listen enough. They don't listen enough. They don't pay attention to really, guys, can we put our glasses aside and really look and listen what people have to tell us?
Yeah, it's really funny to see the Chinese also camping out on this women in STEM and women in science kind of narrative, because which narrative is more focused on in Western discourse than that, you know? Like that's you know, everyone from Hillary Clinton onwards, you know, kind of that's the only thing they talk about. So it's very funny to see this kind of as a form of discourse entrepreneurialism in action.
Very quickly, two other stories to keep your eye on this week. So William Ruto, the newly elected president of Kenya, he is confirmed and in office, and he received a message from Chinese President Xi Jinping. He also spoke with Secretary Blinken. I think he spoke with Biden, and if I recall, I'm not 100% sure on that, but all of the congratulations are coming in. Next week, the hard work begins for the president because he's facing an economic crisis of magnificent proportions, and debt restructuring with the Chinese is going to be very high on the agenda. Also this week, lots of news in the Zambian debt restructuring front. The Zambians have requested $8.4 billion of debt. It's hard to say. They don't want cash, but they also want debt relief. But basically, the idea of the $8.4 billion number accounts for 90% of the debt repayments between now and 2025. So they're basically asking to write off the debt repayments between now and 2025. No word back from the Chinese co-chaired creditor committee if they're going to agree to that. The big issue for the Chinese is what kind of precedent do they set in Zambia that will then be carried over to Ethiopia, potentially into Sri Lanka and into Laos. And Cobus, you and I have been following the events in Sri Lanka very closely. A lot of people have been drawing comparisons between what's been going on in Zambia and Sri Lanka, but you and I pointed out this week in some of our coverage that some very big differences, particularly related to the geopolitics among the Chinese, Japanese, and Indians, who are all key players in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, it's very interesting that there's a lot of pressure, particularly in the right-wing press in Japan, about the kind of calling for Japan to put pressure on Sri Lanka to sideline China in its involvement there, and of course, kind of the India, the situation between India and China is so inflamed that that I think similar kind of sentiments are coming from India. So it looks like the fact that Sri Lanka is on the hook to all three of these massive kind of bilateral lenders at roughly the same rates, like all of them roughly 10% of the total, means that there's going to be some geopolitical kind of pressure on Sri Lanka.
Those are Asia's three largest powers that really don't get along at all with each other. Well, at least the Chinese with the Indians and the Chinese with the Japanese. That makes it very, very difficult to find the kind of solution and the harmony that we're seeing in Zambia. So be very careful in terms of drawing lines, be saying, well, this happened in Zambia, so therefore in Sri Lanka it'll be this way. The politics in each of these countries is going to be very, very different. Very quickly before we go, let's get a preview from Geraud of what you've got coming up on the Afrique-Chine podcast and some of the stories you're working on for the Projet Afrique-Chine for those of our listeners who speak French.
So yes, for the Projet Afrique-Chine this week, we're going to be talking about soft power. It's interesting. We're talking about Chinese soft power in Africa. We're going to receive a researcher from Cameroon. We're going to be talking about how Chinese using technology in terms of soft power tool in Africa. We also have different stories in Cameroon, still in Cameroon, pollution, where we have Chinese miners and Chinese miners in gold, pollution in villages. So different stories talking about environment and politics, soft power in Africa. So just tune in and you're going to be following everything that we do in terms of covering China in Africa in French. It's I'd like to tell people, it's a one-stop shop where you have all information related to China-Africa engagement in French. So come, tune in, and we're going to be really happy. You're going to be receiving newsletter. If you come and just put your email, you're going to be receiving newsletter twice a week where we cover extensively as much as we can Chinese engagement in Africa. And yes, if you're happy with what we do and you'd like to support us, don't hesitate, join our Patreon community, and Eric's going to give you more detail about it, guys. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. Yeah.
Our Patreon community is so important. A big, huge thank you to all of our Patreon supporters at patreon.com/China Africa Project. You guys are heroes to us. Also, if you want to sign up for that newsletter that Geraud talked about, all you have to do is go to Projet Afrique-Chine. Again, links to that in the show notes here. There's a little bar right at the top of the page, and you just put your email address in there. Geraud is getting rave reviews for his newsletter that goes out on Tuesdays and Fridays. You should check it out. Again, it's in French. If you'd like to get daily coverage from Cobus, myself, and the entire team on all of the issues that we talked about in nerdy detail that you won't find anywhere else, but so important to give you those talking points every day, perspectives from the global south. All of us live in developing countries, so we're not in that Washington, New York, London bubble. If you want that different perspective, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You'll get a 30-day free trial just to see what it's like. $7 for students, $15 a month for everybody else. We would be so grateful for your support for this kind of independent journalism, to support journalists like Cobus and Geraud and Nesrine Kamal, our editor in Cairo as well, and all of our team around the world. So let's leave the conversation there. We'll be back again next week. We've got some great interviews lined up. I wanted to bring you Geraud and Cobus this week to go through all of the exciting events that took place. If you'd like more, again, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. All of the coverage is there. For Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg and Geraud Neema in Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at ProjetAfriqueChine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.